The typical American worker has about $87,000 saved in his 401k by his late 50s. Most retirement calculators say the number should be closer to $700,000. That's a $600,000 gap per person, and most of the men I know who are sitting on it have no idea it exists. They look fine. The math says they're not. 2 summers ago, I helped my neighbor Steve back his brand new fishing boat down a ramp at Lake Hartwell for what turned out to be the only time he ever used it. Steve was 56. He had just signed off on a $58,000 Boston whaler, financed at 7.25% over 10 years, because in his words, he had been working for 34 years and he was tired of waiting for the right time. His exact words to me while we were strapping it down were, "I deserve this." 11 weeks later, his company announced a restructuring. His entire region got consolidated under someone in Charlotte, and he was offered a severance that covered 6 months. He is, as of last week, 18 months into trying to find a comparable job. The boat is sitting under a tarp in his side yard. The best offer he's gotten from a dealer is $38,000. He still owes $46,000. I want to talk to you today about the decade that nobody on personal finance YouTube actually warns you about, which is your 50s. I've watched a half dozen men I respect walk straight into some version of these 5 traps in the same 10-year window, and every one of them said the same thing Steve said, which was that they had earned it, or they had time, or it would all work out. None of them were stupid. All of them got hit. I'm Tom. This channel is about real personal finance, the kind that actually works for normal people, instead of the kind that gets you to click on a thumbnail. No motivational fluff, no fantasy returns, no get rich quick. Just what the math actually does over time. If that's what you want, hit subscribe. Today, we're walking through 5 traps I've watched almost every man I know in his 50s either step into or barely sidestep. And at the end, I'll show you the pattern that connects them, plus 3 specific things you can do this week to start plugging the leaks. Some of this is going to sting if you're in or near this decade. Stay with me. The goal isn't to make you feel bad. It's to make sure the next 5 years cost you less than the last 5 did for the guys I'm about to tell you about. Here's the whole video in 1 sentence. You think the danger of your 50s is not having saved enough. The actual danger is that everything you did right up to this decade now has different math behind it than it did at 30. Let's walk through what that means. The first trap is the one Steve walked into, and the category is bigger than just boats. It's the truck, the motorcycle, the RV, the lake cabin, the second motorcycle, the country club membership, anything expensive that men in their 50s buy because 30 years of work feels like it should produce some kind of visible reward by now. Almost every man I know who hit the wall in his 50s walked into that wall carrying a 5-figure or 6-figure toy he had owned for less than 2 years. The math on why this is the worst possible age to buy a depreciating toy is something nobody explains, so let me try. Your 50s are the most dangerous decade for what financial people call sequence of returns risk. It's a fancy term for a simple idea. A portfolio that takes a hit in your 30s has decades to recover before you need the money. The same hit in your 50s leaves you 3 to 7 years from drawing down, and recovering from a bad year right before you stop earning is brutal. A dollar lost at 55 is, in real retirement terms, about 3 times as expensive as a dollar lost at 35, which makes your 50s the worst time to spend big on anything that loses value. Every dollar going out the door is a dollar that will not be there during the most dangerous 5 years of your investing life. Steve's boat, beyond the cash and the loan, also runs about $13,000 a year in slip fees, insurance, fuel, and maintenance, which he is now paying out of a savings account, no longer being refilled by a paycheck. Owned for 3 years and sold at a loss, like Steve's almost certainly will be, you're around $90,000 of wealth deleted, roughly 2.5 years of normal saving at his income level. The trap isn't that men in their 50s want a boat. It's that the wanting and the buying have collapsed into one decision, with no friction in between, justified by the same internal narrative that there will be plenty of time and plenty of income to make it up later. The version of you who is 56 does not know that the version who is 58 will be unemployed. Your decision needs to assume he might be. The second trap is the "I'll work until 67" assumption, and it's the most expensive miscalibration in retirement planning. I have a friend named Doug, who's 55, an IT manager at a regional bank making $145,000. His retirement plan, when I asked him about it 3 years ago, started with, "Well, I'll definitely work until at least 67. He said this with the same confidence I'd use to say I'll have coffee in the morning. His follow-up, which I've heard from probably 20 other men his age, was that he'd ramp up savings in the last 10 years before retirement, because that's when he'd have the most to put away. The 2026 Employee Benefit Research Institute Retirement Confidence Survey tracks this gap, and it's one of the most miscalibrated assumptions in personal finance. The median expected retirement age among workers is 65. Among actual retirees, the median is 62, and 3 in 5 stopped working before 65. About half retired earlier than planned, the largest causes being health problems, caregiving demands, and employer-driven changes like layoffs and buyouts. 75% of workers say they intend to keep working in some form during retirement. Only 29% of actual retirees report doing so. The gap between expectation and outcome is the entire trap. Most men in their 50s are not planning, they are deferring, pushing the savings work into a future that assumes future them will have more income, more discipline, and more time. The data says future them will, with about a 1 in 2 probability, be out of the workforce before he expected to be, with no chance to make up the gap. Doug's situation is more typical than he realizes. He has $230,000 in his 401k. The most recent Vanguard How America Saves report puts the median 401k balance for ages 55 to 64 at about $87,000, with the average closer to $245,000. Doug is right at the average, which sounds reassuring until you remember that average at 55 is nowhere close to on track. If he gets pushed out at 58 or 60, like a meaningful share of his peers will, his 12-year plan compresses to 3 or 5, and his portfolio is potentially $600,000 short of where he needed to be. The trap isn't that he won't make it. It's that he's playing a game which depends on conditions he doesn't actually control. This is where Steve walks back into the story. Steve didn't plan to retire in his late 50s either. The decision was not his. The same restructuring that took his job took his employer health insurance, his 401k match, and his savings runway, all in the same week. He is, in the technical sense, retired now, in the worst version of what that word can mean. About 1 in 2 men in their late 50s is one bad earnings report away from being him. The fix is not complicated, but it requires a psychological shift that almost no one in his 50s wants to make. You have to plan for the version of you that retires at 62, not the version that retires at 67. If you save aggressively enough to be okay at 62, and you end up working until 67, you get a 5-year head start on the retirement you actually wanted. Plan for 67 and get forced out at 62, and you are 5 years behind on a plan that didn't have margin to begin with. The third trap is the sandwich. Carl is 54, a project manager at a mid-sized construction firm making $110,000, with 2 dependents he didn't expect to have at this stage. His mother, 81, has mild dementia and lives in assisted living that runs about $5,800 a month. Carl covers around $2,200 of that after her Social Security and her late husband's pension handle the rest. On top of that, his 28-year-old daughter moved back home after a divorce with her 3-year-old son, contributing what she can while she finishes a nursing degree. Carl has been quietly draining his retirement savings to keep all of this running, and he is going to be in serious trouble in about 4 years if nothing changes. AARP's most recent caregiving research found there are about 63 million family caregivers in the United States, an increase of roughly 20 million over the last decade, and the average caregiver spends about $7,200 a year out of pocket on care-related expenses for an adult relative. For caregivers helping with dementia or serious mental health issues, that average is closer to $9,000. Almost half of caregivers under 50 are simultaneously raising a child under 18, which is what gives this trap its name. The sandwich gets squeezed from both sides at exactly the decade you needed to be saving most aggressively. The hardest part is that there is no clean financial fix, because the real problem is emotional, not arithmetic. Carl knows the math. He knows his retirement is bleeding. He also cannot tell his mother she needs to move into a cheaper facility, and he cannot tell his daughter to figure it out on her own, and he is not going to. The question for men in this trap is not whether to help, it's how to help without going down with the ship. And that requires 3 conversations almost no man in his 50s wants to have. One with your parents about their actual finances. One with your adult kids about a hard timeline for being on their own. And one with yourself about an annual cap you'll actually stick to. None of those are comfortable, and all of them are the difference between 2 retirements failing and 1 surviving. You cannot fund 3 retirements out of 1 income. The math allows 1 fully funded with modest supplements to 2 others. Try to fully fund all 3, and the only one you control fails, after which nobody gets supported and nobody retires. Quick interruption. If any of this is landing, hit subscribe. The algorithm is dumb enough that the only reason it keeps showing this kind of video to the people who need it is because viewers like you tap 1 button. That's the whole transaction. Back to it. The 4th trap is the most invisible of the 5. Concentrated company stock. Ed has worked at the same Fortune 500 company for 31 years. He's 57, a senior engineer, makes about $190,000 with bonuses, and a meaningful share of his net worth is sitting in his employer's stock, accumulated through restricted stock units, an ESPP, vested performance shares, and a 401k match that defaults into company stock. Last time I sat down with him and his wife, 63% of their investable assets were in this single ticker. Ed will tell you this is fine because he knows the company. He sees the executive team's moves, the order pipeline, the product roadmap. None of that is unique to Ed. Every employee at Enron in 2001 believed the same things, as did the people at Bear Stearns in 2007 and the long-tenured engineers at GE before its decade-long slide. The pattern is consistent. The people most confident in their employer's stock are the ones who work there, which is exactly the problem. Single stock risk is dangerous on its own, and it gets much worse when the stock is your own employer's, because your income and your investment are now perfectly correlated. If something goes wrong with the company, you lose your job and your portfolio in the same week. The rule of thumb in actual portfolio theory is that no single stock should ever exceed 10 to 15% of your investable assets, and 0 stocks at all in your employer if you can avoid it. Most men in Ed's situation have 8 or 10 times that exposure, and they all have the same story for why their company is the exception. The fix is straightforward and emotionally difficult, in that order. You set up a recurring sell order through your broker, the same way you'd set up a recurring monthly investment, except in reverse. A fixed share count, automatic on a fixed date each quarter, until your concentration is under 15%. The tax hit is by design smaller than the catastrophic cost of being right about your employer until the day you're wrong. Automation matters more than timing, because the version of you who has to make this decision manually next quarter is the version who'll find a reason not to. Ed's wife has been asking him to start for 6 years. He keeps saying he'll start next quarter. The 5th trap is the one almost nobody talks about, and it's healthcare. Mark retired at 56. His financial plan, on paper, looked solid. He had $2 million in retirement accounts, a paid-off house, and Social Security in 9 years. He had run the numbers carefully. The number he had not run was healthcare. When you leave a job before 65, you exit the employer insurance system, and unless your former company offers retiree health benefits, which according to recent KFF data, only about 27% of large firms still do, you are buying coverage on the open market. Most people end up on the Affordable Care Act marketplace, where pricing is age-rated and significantly higher in your late 50s and early 60s. Federal rules let insurers charge people in their 60s up to 3 times what they charge 21-year-olds. And the 2026 average national unsubsidized annual premium for a 60-year-old on the benchmark Silver plan is about $15,900, with deductibles north of $5,000 on top of that. The enhanced premium tax credits that had been making this manageable through 2025 expired at the end of last year. Anyone with retirement income above roughly $63,000 for a single person or $85,000 for a couple no longer qualifies for ACA subsidies at all. KFF found the typical 60-year-old just above the income cliff is now paying about $9,600 more per year than they were in 2025. Mark and his wife pulled their tax return together in March and discovered their annual premium had jumped from about $9,000 to almost $27,000. For 9 years of bridge coverage, that's $250,000 that was not in his retirement plan. This is also where Steve becomes the most uncomfortable example in the video. Steve isn't retired. He never planned to be. But once his employer health insurance ran out 3 months after severance ended, he and his wife went on the marketplace and discovered exactly what Mark discovered, in worse circumstances. Their combined premium for 2026 came in at $26,000, paid out of an emergency fund sized for 6 months of unemployment, not 18. Every dollar of slip fees, loan interest, and insurance Steve paid on that boat over the last 2 summers is a dollar no longer in the emergency fund about to run dry. The trap here is not retiring early. It's retiring early without a separate, fully funded line item for the health insurance bridge, plus a meaningful buffer for the part outside your control. If you are planning to retire at 62, the math on your bridge years should assume one number, which is roughly $200,000 of healthcare cost between you and Medicare. That number, not the 5 or 10 you probably had in mind, lives outside your retirement portfolio and outside your spending plan. If it isn't sitting in a separate account by the time you walk out of work, you are not retired. You are unemployed, pretending to be retired. Your 50s feel like the safe zone, but they are actually the most dangerous decade you'll ever financially navigate, because you have the most to lose, the least time to recover, and the highest temptation to take your foot off the brake. Every one of these traps is a version of the same mistake, treating your 50s like the back half of your earning years when they're actually the front half of your transition years. Nobody in this video is going broke in one visible event. Each is losing wealth through a slow leak. 5 separate small holes that ran for years before anybody noticed the water level. Pick any retirement that ended worse than expected, and what you'll find inside isn't one catastrophic mistake. It's 5 quiet leaks that ran for a decade until the boat was empty before the man understood it was sinking. One more thing about Steve before we get to what you should do this week. He listed the boat in March, took the $8,000 loss, and stopped writing checks for slip fees, insurance, and storage he couldn't afford. The job isn't back yet. Steve's interviewing 2 states over and may have to move. But the slow leak stopped 2 months ago, which is the part most men in his position never reach. The wealth that was leaving every month is no longer leaving. The hole hasn't been refilled, but it's not getting deeper. That's the move. Everything after that is recoverable. Here's what I want you to actually do this week. I'm being specific because vague advice would defeat the entire point. First, calculate your fixed monthly obligations as a percentage of your monthly take-home pay. Mortgage or rent, car payments, insurance, tuition, club dues, subscriptions you can't exit with a phone call, loan minimums, any committed transfer to a family member. Total it, divide by take-home. If the number is over 55%, you don't have a discipline problem. You have a structural problem, and at least one obligation needs to be a candidate for elimination in the next 6 months. Cancel one this week. Anyone. Second, if you have any employer stock anywhere in your portfolio, log into your 401k and your brokerage today and find out what percentage of your investable assets is in that single ticker. If the answer is over 15%, set up an automatic quarterly sell of a fixed share count starting next month and let it run until the number is under 15. You will not get this done if you wait to do it manually. The automation is the entire strategy. Third, if you are planning to retire before 65, write down the year you intend to stop working and the year you turn 65. Multiply the gap by $20,000 per person in your household. That number is your healthcare bridge, and it needs to be sitting in a separate, conservative account by the time you walk out of work, not added to your general retirement spending. If it isn't there yet, push the retirement date until it is. 3 things. None requiring a financial advisor, all of them startable or finishable this weekend. Whichever of the 5 traps was rationalizing itself in your head while I was talking, that's the one to start with. If you want the prevention version of this conversation, the moves you should be making in your 40s so that your 50s never look like Steve's, I made a video on this channel called Major Money Milestones to Accomplish in Your 40s. Watch that next. Drop a comment with which trap hit closest to home, even if it's the one you're embarrassed about. I read every comment and I'll reply to as many as I can. Hit subscribe because that's the next video. I'll see you in the next one.